Well, this is a short presentation, and some of you will have heard this before because I've done some teaching using these slides, and so Jason and Astor will have seen some of them before. Yeah, so one of my principal interests is comparing planning systems. And I've been trying to do this since about 1994. So I'm trying to get an understanding of how planning systems differ. But of course it immediately sets up all sorts of very difficult problems about, well, first question, what do you mean by a planning system? And questions about what do we compare to a journal paper. And I've got copies of the paper. I've got an 8,000 word paper on this subject if people want to. And in fact, I think you were there last year when I gave an earlier version of this paper at the ESOP Congress. Now, just before I talk about the paper though, I wanted to say what we're doing here in relation to comparative planning. I'm hoping that this comparison of planning systems becomes an important part of our work in the chair. And towards that aim, I've, with Dominic Stead, established a network which is funded by the German Academy for Spatial Research. And over 3 years, they are paying for 9 or 10 meetings of a group of academics from different universities in Europe to talk about comparing planning systems. And these are the things that we've got on our agenda. We've had 2 meetings so far, one in Delft last year and one in Dortmund. And we have another one coming up in June in Aachen. And I'm hoping that in 2010 we'll be holding a big conference here, or a conference here, on comparing planning systems. These are the sorts of things we're interested in, the comparative method. We've decided at the outset that one of the major problems is methodology, so we want to start with that. We're going to talk about planning cultures as well as comparing systems and tools and procedures and policies. We also think it's important to compare the underlying cultures. We're interested in the extent to which you can transfer policies from one place to another. And also a particular interest of mine is what I term modernisation. It's not the right word. If somebody can suggest an alternative, please do. But what I know is that a lot of reform is going on at the moment in planning systems. And I want to understand that process better, what's happening. So, a note to start with about the value of cross-national comparison. And it's interesting, we've got such an international audience here. And I'm used to that. It was the same where I worked before. And we're all working internationally in a way. When I first started looking at planning systems in other countries, I already knew quite a bit about the UK planning system. In fact, I was publishing a textbook on the UK planning system. But I realised when I started to look at other planning systems how little I knew about my own system. My view was very narrow. It was from inside the system. And I only described it in the terms from inside the system. And when I started to look at the way that planning operated in other countries, then I began to see how narrow I'd been. And now I've been able to think about the planning system in the UK in a much more rounded way, I think. And I think the value of these other comparisons that I say here is it exposes what you take for granted, what you assume when you're only working within one country. And I'll come back to that later. It also directly informs, it stimulates our practice, it gives us ideas, but of course we do have to be very careful about thinking we can transpose solutions from one place to another place. But in the European, and my work is concentrated so far on Western Europe, although I'm hoping we can expand that. In Western Europe, it's particularly relevant because we have a very closely integrated governance system through the European Union, which establishes a number of laws and policies which have to be implemented in the member states, all of which have different sorts of systems. Now, that's a sort of supranational planning activity. And if you're going to engage in that, if you want to get more equivalence of environmental standards in planning from one country to another, then you need to understand the different mechanisms that are in use in those countries in the planning systems. And so it's very relevant, and for that reason we have been able to do a lot of what I call client-oriented research on comparing planning systems. That is, the member states and the European Commission are interested in this question, and they're prepared to pay for research on this because they want to understand these differences. But unfortunately, a lot of that work is not very academic. There's also issues to do with, from an academic perspective, it's interesting to see whether there's convergence or divergence. And in the context of globalization, a lot of people argue that we're getting closer together in the way that we do plan. And for me also, I would say that when you start to do comparisons, you actually get right inside a theory of planning. You know, just what is planning? You start to really have to consider questions like that. I would say, for instance, that looking at Francisco, what I've learned already coming to the Netherlands is how design approach is sort of infused, like this tea actually, it runs right through the system of planning here and the planning culture, and it doesn't in other countries. And so you have to get right at the heart of this theory of planning. Actually, and also it is good fun because you meet a lot of interesting people and you can travel to these places as well. So it's good, yeah. Now, in this network, when we have discussions about comparing planning systems, one thing we're very aware of is the lack of, what's the right phrase? Where the insufficiency, the weak nature of previous research comparing planning systems. It's just not very good, partly because it's been directed and paid for by clients who have specific practical questions which they want to answer. So there's a number of criticisms of the way that we've done comparisons in the past, especially is insufficient reflection on the methodology. We're not very good at methodology. We tend to emphasize the government aspects too much, and the categorizations that we develop of planning systems tend to hide more than they reveal. Now, these are in fact my conclusions, so I'm starting with in case we run out of time for the rest of the paper, I've started with the conclusions. But underlying all this is a central question which I'd like you to think about, which I'm really worrying about. And this is why I can't publish this paper, really. Because I want to get at the criteria. What criteria should we use to compare systems? That means, to put that simply, what should we be comparing? If we're saying we're going to compare planning systems, what is it we should be comparing? Now, I've probably asked the PhD students who were in a session where I asked this question anyway. I like to ask the students that. Because when you start to answer that question, it reveals what you think planning is as well. You know, or aspects of what you think planning is. So, but it does, the reason we have these weaknesses is because comparison is really, really difficult. And everybody's, you know, anybody who works in an international context knows that. There's methodological challenges. There's real strong practical problems in doing work across countries in terms of collecting comparable data. But more important than that is this rootedness in context, that you can only understand the planning system in relation to the conditions in which it operates. And because of that, you have great difficulty with concepts, and having concepts that travel. People talk about travelling concepts. And in comparative political work, for instance, in the 1960s and 70s, you know, there's a lot of comparisons of US politics with European politics and other places in the world. They looked for universal concepts. They tried to invent concepts that could be applied in any country. And if you have universal concepts, they tend to be very general and very broad.